Broadcasting live from the Subaru of Gwinnett studio inside the Sonesta Gwinnett Place Atlanta Hotel. It's time for Travel Safely with Brian Mulligan. Travel Safely is presented by Applied Information, creator of the Travel Safely smartphone app.
Welcome everyone to Travel Safely, the business talk show bringing you the latest in innovation from transportation, technology, and entrepreneurship. I'm your host, Brian Mulligan, coming to you from the Subaru Business RadioX studio in Gwinnett County. This show is sponsored by Applied Information, a technology company here in Gwinnett, focused on using technology to save lives and improve the traffic. Our guest today is Rebecca Brewster, President and Chief Operating Officer of the American Transportation Research Institute. That's ATRI for short, which we're going to use in the show. ATRI is the trucking industry's not-for-profit research organization whose mission it is research to improve the trucking industry's safety and productivity. So welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you, Brian. It's great to be here today.
So our topic for the day, the trucking industry. We all know about the trucking industry because we drive alongside these big rigs on the interstate, and we know how vital they are to the economy, especially as the economy is dealing with an aging infrastructure at the same time as new technology and the delivered economy. So let's find out some more. So Rebecca, start off with the Rebecca Brewster story. How did you come to be in Georgia and in the trucking business?
Well, it's a great story, and I've actually been in the trucking industry now for about 30 years, but the past 26 years I've been with ATRI, and I came down to Atlanta one weekend to visit a friend, and I had some experience in the trucking industry, and I'd had some experience with the Chamber of Commerce doing governmental affairs work. And this was, of course, back in the day when job postings were in the newspaper, so I was looking in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and ATRI was looking for someone to fill a public policy analyst position. I applied, and the rest is history.
Oh, wow. Okay. So you've been in Atlanta all the years since then.
I have indeed, 26 years.
So you know, the research is a broad topic. So what do you guys do on a practical basis? Government research, private sector research, safety? What is it that you guys actually do? Maybe some practical examples.
Absolutely. Well, as you mentioned in the intro, our focus is research to improve the trucking industry's safety and productivity. So sometimes that covers very specific issues like the impact of the hours of service rules, the rules that govern when drivers can drive and when they sleep. Sometimes it's broader, looking at how we fund transportation infrastructure, because of course the nation's roadways are our workplace in the trucking industry. And so a broader look at what's the most efficient way to fund transportation infrastructure is a topic that ATRI has studied. So some are very specific to the trucking industry and some are much more broad in scope.
So let's look at some of the statistics of the trucking industry. I mean, we see trucks everywhere. How many trucks are out there, and how many miles do you guys actually do?
Well, in our space in the trucking industry, we're talking generally about Class 8 vehicles. Those are the tractor trailers that people think of
the big rigs,
in the trucking industry. Right. So the latest data we have is about just under 4 million Class 8 vehicles out on the road.
Wow.
To be specific, 3.68 million Class 8 vehicles out on the road. It's a lot, but when you think about it, Brian, everything that touches our lives lived on some point on a truck, whether it was raw materials going to a manufacturing facilities, whether it was the food we eat, the gasoline we put in our cars, the clothes that we wear. All of those items travel at some point on a truck before they are ultimately delivered to us through a gas station or a grocery store or a department store. And so as consumer demand goes up, so does the demand for trucking.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of issues that probably be front of mind. One is that this whole balance between private sector initiative, and trucking is a private sector business with some large companies, but also some mom and pop operations, and then government regulation, which is the business of safety. How do you live between those two worlds of government regulation and private sector initiative trying to get more bang for their buck?
Well, it's interesting, and one point I want to bring out that people don't really realize is that you see some of the big trucking companies, and you referenced, there are a lot of big trucking companies, and there are, but nearly 92% of the trucking companies out there operate 6 or fewer trucks. So when you talk about a mom and pop industry, we really are. We are a lot of small business people. And so obviously the impact of government regulations, and with that the associated cost of those regulations, is oftentimes a challenge for an industry made up of small organizations. But there are instances where the industry has embraced and in fact advocated on behalf of government regulations. For instance, we have, as of the last several years, what's called the Electronic Logging Device Mandate, or ELD mandate, we call them in the industry, and that's electronically recording the hours that a driver drives, when they're off duty, when they're just working but not driving the vehicle, so that they can be compliant with the federal rules that govern those activities. And the industry supported for the most part, the industry supported the ELD mandate because it was a way to make sure that everyone is compliant with those hours of service rules.
And that's actually a great point for technology, because that's all based around a technology of being able to record when the truck's moving and so forth, and when the driver is active or not active and so forth. And so, a lot of the smaller operations, they don't mind regulations so much if it's a level playing field. But when they feel like they're being penalized, then you end up with a tough situation.
Absolutely. And quite frankly, if I had a nickel for every time I heard the term level playing field, oftentimes in this industry, but it is so apt here because, again, for those who were operating under the rules and compliant with the hours of service rules, whether it was being recorded on paper or if they had adopted an ELD already, this was no big change for them. But for those who were operating outside, and they were small percentage of the industry, but there are some who were operating outside of the hours of service rules, they really had a competitive advantage because they were skirting the rules basically to make those deliveries. And so the ELD mandate allows and empowers compliance by everyone.
So the two things that come to mind from the truck driver point of view is the first one is is this driver fatigue? I understand is a big cause of or contributor to accidents. Are they seeing an improvement in accident rates with less driver fatigue? How's that research looking?
And actually, fatigue is a small contributor to truck-involved crashes. They are oftentimes, when we do see fatigue-involved crashes, they are crashes that involve a truck driver going off the road on a rural route.
A single vehicle
crash. But overall, the percentage of truck-involved crashes that have fatigue as a contributing cause is very low. But certainly it is an issue that the industry takes very seriously. And when you think about the task of driving a truck, especially long haul, where you have, particularly if you're out west, long stretches of monotonous road, you can imagine how it might become fatiguing. And so that's why we have hours of service rules that mandate how long a driver can drive and be behind the wheel, and then how long they must take a rest before that clock starts over again.
Are you seeing sort of driver-assisted systems, lane keeping, those kind of systems, penetrating the trucking industry?
Absolutely. The trucking industry invests about $9.5 billion annually in safety technology because it sees the value and the return on investment of those technologies. So everything from lane keeping assist, collision mitigation systems. These systems all help forward-facing and driver-facing cameras are really getting a lot of penetration in the industry now as a great way because so often, Brian, the research shows that in truck and car-involved crashes, more often than not, the crash is caused by some action on the part of the car drivers. Car drivers do not really understand how to safely drive around large commercial vehicles. So if a fleet installs a forward-facing camera that's triggered by some event, a hard brake or some other event, more often than not, that video footage is exonerating the truck driver who was doing what they were supposed to be doing, and it's the car driver who comes in and maneuvers unsafely around that vehicle.
That's actually a great example of the use of technology and the use of video and so forth to actually, provide some truth in these kind of things, because everybody loves to blame the truck. I mean, it's a commercial vehicle, they must have a good liability policy, so let's ding them for what we can, even if it's the car's fault.
Absolutely, and so that's why fleets are really embracing the use of video, because again, large commercial vehicle involved with a car, more than likely the car is going to suffer more damage, and it's going to be the truck driver's word against the car driver's word. And so, the use of the video really does save trucking companies although there's an investment in cost in those video systems, does save the trucking company a lot of times in litigation, because if it is, if they're at fault, if it is something the truck driver did incorrect, then they immediately have the evidence of that and they can work that out. But more often than not, it shows what the truck driver says was true. You know, I was doing what I was supposed to do and a car left its lane or jumped right in front of me and slammed on their brakes. These unsafe driving behaviors.
Yeah, well, because in our business in the surface transportation space, the whole business of connected and autonomous vehicles is becoming the buzzword that we're dealing with traffic lights and so forth. And I know there's been some highly publicized events on the trucking side with platooning and an autonomous Budweiser beer run. Tell us about that.
So we actually were involved as one of the independent observers of the Budweiser beer run, where they did take a load of beer over the course of an evening, and at some point during that trip, the truck driver got out of his seat and went back into the sleeper berth. Now, he was obviously in the truck the entire time, but my colleague who observed that, was streaming the whole thing, said at one point a car driver, we call them four-wheelers in the trucking industry, a four-wheeler came up beside the truck, looked up, saw there was no driver in the seat of that truck, and sped out of there, because I'm sure they thought they had stumbled onto a movie set or something, because it was frightening to see a truck without a driver behind it.
You must think that truck is just in danger of imminent catastrophe. I can only imagine. Well, in fact, one of the things that this brings about is the education of the public to autonomous vehicles and also to safe driving behavior around trucks. And, in our driver ed, putting our kids through driver ed, there wasn't much about that at all.
There really isn't, and that's a whole separate issue, sort of changing that paradigm at the state licensing agencies and driver's ed courses so that they teach students how to drive around trucks. And I have to applaud the American Trucking Associations. They've done a great job of really getting the word out about that. But when we talk about autonomous vehicles, I mean, we've done research that makes it clear that we're not going to eliminate the need for truck drivers. It's not going to be a solution to the driver shortage in that we're not going to have trucks going down the road without drivers for a very long time. But the use of the technology, I believe, and our research has documented this, is going to make it easier for us as an industry to bring new people into the industry. When you think about young people who have grown up using technology their whole lives, and to get into the cab of a fully equipped truck now with all the latest technology, it's a very cool experience. Right,
then you're actually much more of a technology operator rather than a quote-unquote truck driver. And so what about electric? We see this move to electric vehicles. How's that impacting the trucking industry?
Well, certainly there are more applications in the trucking industry, or some applications in the truck industry where electric makes sense. And I think about local pickup and delivery, where you have the ability to recharge that vehicle overnight. Where you have a little more challenge, of course, is in the long haul over the road sector, where, one, as a nation, we just don't have the infrastructure for that recharging those large vehicles. And, what is the grid impact from recharging large numbers of large vehicles? But where it does make sense, we're seeing electric already start to make some penetration.
Oh, wow. Well, after the break, let's talk about how Georgia rates for the trucking industry and find out about bottlenecks for truckers in the States. But first, we've got 30 Seconds with Sarah.
This is your 30 Seconds or Less with Sarah. For a company known for its loud, gas-powered, iconic hogs, Harley-Davidson is pivoting its strategy. After flagging sales in the motorcycle industry, it now pins its hopes on Livewire, a completely electric motorbike that runs near silently. This sleek, silent Livewire does 0 to 60 in 3 seconds and has a range of 146 miles. And it's a bet from Harley-Davidson that the future and millennials will be electric and connected. Industry analysts question whether such an iconic Americana symbol can shift consumer perception and their pocketbooks. Back to you, Brian.
In case you're just joining us, this is Travel Safely with Brian Mulligan, how to save lives and improve traffic, with our guest Rebecca Brewster, President and Chief Operating Officer of the American Transportation Research Institute. Rebecca, so let's talk about Georgia and the trucking industry. Our economy here is really dependent on transportation, both air, sea, and land. What does the trucking industry mean for Georgia?
Well, trucking is a big deal in Georgia. This is a big trucking state, and in fact, 76% of the communities in Georgia are serviced exclusively by the trucking industry to get what they need. And so it is a big deal. We see a lot of trucks. Of course, I live here in Atlanta, and we're very familiar with trucks on the highway. But we have to remember, yes, we're stuck in traffic. Yes, there's a lot of congestion here in Atlanta. And yes, there are a lot of trucks. But we have to remember all of those trucks are carrying the things you and I use every single day.
And I think that that's probably what most people don't appreciate, is that just what a driver it is to the economy to be able to transport goods effectively from one place to another. And that's a great statistic, that 76% of communities would just be without bread and milk if there wasn't for the trucking industry, never mind all the other goods that they use.
That's exactly right. And, I think we all too often as a public forget, we're the ones who are driving all that demand for consumer goods. It's us who wants all that stuff. And so it has to be delivered somehow. We don't have railroad tracks pulling up to the back of our grocery store. All of that food has to go in on a truck.
So where are the major bottlenecks here in Atlanta, and what could we do about that potentially?
I love talking bottlenecks. It's even earned me a nickname. I'm called Becky Bottleneck. So,
Great.
But we've been studying bottlenecks at ATRI for a number of years using truck GPS data to figure out where trucks are not moving as efficiently as they should. And each year we publish a list of the top 100. Well, Georgia is quite a familiar city or state on that list, and Atlanta has 6 of the top bottlenecks in the country.
Oof.
Of the top 100. And Spaghetti Junction, in fact, was number 1 for 3 years in a row until this year it got moved down to number 2. It was replaced by Fort Lee, New Jersey, the George Washington Bridge that connects New York and New Jersey. But Spaghetti Junction and all around the perimeter, we have some of those top 100 bottlenecks.
Wow. The big challenge is, if you look at Spaghetti Junction, it's a big interchange here in Atlanta in the north of the city. It's just these massive flyovers and things like that. But to add lanes would be, hundreds of billions of dollars. How can we possibly solve these problems?
Well, obviously, that's an instance where building additional capacity may not be the solution. And that's where we have to look to things like how we operate the system and how we use technology. Certainly in the trucking industry, we do what we can to route our trucks through these bottlenecks at less congested times. A lot of that times that's driven by the customers, the shippers and receivers. But when we can, we'll route our trucks through these areas at less congested times. We use technology to tell us how to go. So when there's a traffic incident, we get notification and we move our trucks to different locations when we can. Because every minute that truck driver sits stuck in traffic, it's not only chewing away at their available hours of service, how long they're able to drive, but it's wasting fuel, it's creating wear and tear on the vehicle, and there are a whole host of other impacts from that driver sitting stuck in traffic that we don't want to experience in the industry.
So there's talk about truck-only lanes, and I know the Georgia Department of Transportation is considering a truck corridor down to Macon and things like that. Is that something that you guys research and support or are involved in?
We have certainly looked at the potential for truck-only lanes. We actually were involved in a study that looked at a multi-state truck-only corridor in 5 states along I-70 in the Midwest. And there's a lot of potential good to come from truck-only lanes. Certainly the separation of cars and trucks cuts down on that occurrence of when car drivers don't drive safely around trucks.
Okay, that's a safety issue. That's something that I hadn't thought of. Truck-only lanes would be a safety issue.
It would indeed, and certainly the productivity that comes from separating us from the general population. Cars can go at the speed they want to, and trucks, which are, just physically heavier, don't have to sit there and cause cars to back up.
Okay, so that's those are a couple of aspects that but obviously the big thing with these truck-only lanes is the capital cost of them and the attaining the right of way. It's a 20-year horizon to be able to add significant new lanes and things like that.
They are not inexpensive, and so ultimately the decision was made not to move forward in the I-70 project at the time, because the question was, how do you pay for it? Do you toll just the trucks who are using that new capacity? Well, the fact of the matter is the four-wheelers are benefiting too if they're not having the trucks in their general traffic stream. And so questions of how you finance that improvement is obviously one of the big issues.
Yeah, so finally getting back to the big picture, and what is the next big thing on the trucking industry for on the horizon for the trucking industry?
Well, one of our biggest issues, and it really is a perennial issue, is our driver shortage. But it is becoming much more challenging for us as an industry. Right now, the estimates are that we're short about 60,000 drivers.
Wow.
But if we don't do something to deal with those who are retiring, to replace those who are retiring, we're going to face an even greater shortage. Estimates are it would top 100,000. And when we start to see shortages like that, Brian, goods don't get delivered. It drives up the price of transportation, so it drives up the price of goods. We've got to do something as an industry to bring more people in to drive trucks.
Yeah, and then the whole economy slows, and then we all suffer. Rebecca, this has been fascinating. So thank you, and thank you for joining me on Travel Safely, brought to you by Applied Information.
Thank you so much for having me today.
Today we've been talking about the challenges and advances in the trucking industry with Rebecca Brewster, President and Chief Operating Officer of the American Transportation Research Institute, which is based in Marietta, Georgia. ATRI is the trucking industry's not-for-profit research organization whose mission it is to research and improve the trucking industry's safety and productivity. Rebecca, thanks for all you do and for helping us make Georgia and the world a better place. Until next time, this is Brian Mulligan signing off from Business Radio X, and travel safely.